What's up, everyone, and welcome to Movie Emporium's Flashback Reviews, where I take movies from the past, break them down, and tell you what I think about them. If you like what you see, of course, hit the subscribe button, join Movie Emporium, hit that notification bell at the very top to find out what's coming next, and comment below on any video that you watch on my channel. So, it's been 45 years since Monty Python and the Holy Grail came out, and that is insane to think about. Not only does it make me feel old that it's now 45 years old, because I think I've seen this movie a billion times, seen it since I was a kid. But it is amazing to think about that it still holds up very, very well. It's still just as funny as when it first came out. It's still just as absurd as when it first came out. It really shows you the power of the Monty Python troupe and how insanely good at what they were doing. Of course, Monty Python includes people like Chapman, Eric Idle, John Cleese, Terry Gilliam, Terry Jones, and Michael Palin. And of course, as we know, if you know Monty Python, they started out as a comedy troupe doing sketch TV series, kind of like Mad TV or SNL, but they were way ahead of their time. They were doing things that nobody else was doing, and it shows in the later stuff that they did. Mr. Bean, I'm assuming was influenced by this. Of course, Fawlty Towers, Absolute Fabulous, that kind of stuff. It was just so ahead of its time, for the simple fact that they were doing absurd humor before absurd humor was a thing. Look at Office and Parks and Rec, which is very absurdist humor. And so it makes a lot of sense. You know, they have some very, very famous sketches like the Lumberjack song, the Dead Parrot, the Funny Walk. It's an incredible thing to see in their Flying Circus days. And then they released a movie called Now for Something Completely Different, which was their segue segment for each episode that they did for their show. And it was more of just a comedic sketch thing that they did where they showed off different sketches they had already done. But Monty Python and the Holy Grail was their first foray into original content for a movie. And it shows that it was their first movie because it is very rough around the edges. There are some stuff that doesn't make any sense. But it's very, very funny, and it's Terry Gilliam's first movie as well as Terry Jones's first movie directing. And of course, Terry Gilliam is very well known as a director in these day and ages. But with that said, it is very, very funny. It has a lot of great moments that I'm going to talk about here in a second. But the one thing I never knew about that was very fascinating about looking into this movie was not only was it very low budgeted, so they couldn't afford horses, which, you know, I'll talk about, but the movie was almost entirely financed by rock bands, you know, because even a crew like Monty Python couldn't find financing anywhere. It's insane to think about that a troupe as famous as Monty Python is now, that at the time they just couldn't, because people thought it was absurd. I'm sure it was very controversial to think about because it's dealing with the Holy Grail. But rock bands are what they are known for being, which is very against the grain, very rock enthusiast. And so bands like Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, Jethro Tull, and of course Elton John actually financed this movie, as well as some record labels. And there is actually, if you think about it, there is a rock aesthetic to this movie, kind of like Pink Floyd's The Wall, where it has a very very kind of strange musical tone to it. But it's not saying that's what it is, but it's very Monty Python, which is a very rockish, absurdist type group of people. But it's really fascinating to think about that this movie would never have happened if it weren't for rock bands. I'm like, it makes me appreciate Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin even more than I already appreciate them, and Elton John, who was a rock god in his own right. But this movie was just, it was very successful when it first came out. It was not a very big hit in the money making space, but it has since gained its money back and many times over and gained a very, very cult following. But as I go through the different sketches, this movie wouldn't work if it weren't for those sketches. Those sketches that they have created, which this movie was actually going to take place in modern time as well as the past, when you actually sit back and watch it, the sketches, if they didn't work, the movie wouldn't work. And they absolutely do work. And that's why I want to talk about each sketch, because it's a movie full of just amazing set pieces and sketches and comedy timing and comedy moments. It shows what would later happen with like Life of Brian and The Meaning of Life, and how on the nose and on spot they were, and how they were willing to push the envelope in any space. I mean, like I said, if you look at Life of Brian and Holy Grail, they're very controversial films because they're dealing with religion, they're dealing with cultisms, they're dealing with the nature of what it's like to be you know, with a certain type of society. And I really find that fascinating. And on top of that, they're dealing with the Holy Grail, so they're dealing with the King Arthur legend, which they really, really make fun of in the later parts of this movie. But this movie starts out, in essence, with a credits sequence, and it is very well known that movies like Star Wars were what pushed the credit sequence to the very end of the movie, which was what Hollywood was very, very against. It's in the documentary, one of the documentaries, but George Lucas talks about how credit sequences were in the beginning, and he really wanted the end to kind of give it a more interesting feel, more like cinematic feel, and later on it changed like that. But with that said, they have the credit sequence at the very beginning. They're showing all the camera operators, blah blah blah, producers, writers, all that good stuff. And what makes the sequence so memorable is the fact that we have basically subtitles that are using Swedish subtitles in aspect. They're not really Swedish, dialect, but it is trying to make it look Swedish. And at first they're like, doing some weird, crazy stuff. And then they start talking about like Swedish mountains and Swedish lands and so on and so forth. And then it takes a 180 kind of turn or 90-degree turn and starts talking about mooses. And it really kind of pushes the envelope of mooses and stuff like that. It really kind of goes full tilt into it, where it just starts naming off different things about mooses and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, it starts talking about a moose that bit somebody. And it's really, really funny because all of a sudden, the credits stop. You hear like the record scratch. And there's a title card or a card that comes up that says, all the people that were doing the subtitles have been sacked. And so they start up the credit sequence again, and there's more and more credits and more subtitles. Like 2 seconds later, the credits stop again, and all of a sudden the people who have done the sacking have now been sacked again. And it's incredible because like if you read the subtitles, it's like insanely ridiculous about mooses and stuff like that. But then the credits start up again, and there's like these credit sequences, these credit mentions with moose like operator, moose like farm hand, just like these different sequences and stuff like that. And like the subtitles and everything about it, at one point it says signed Richard M. Nixon. It starts getting out of hand, and then it finally says the directors have been sacked and so on and so forth. And it's insanely funny, it's insanely ridiculous. And then it switches over because of the whole shenanigans that's been going on. They switch it over into a very vibrant, very 70s-ish subtitle or credit sequence where it's like, photosynthesis and lights blaring everywhere, and it's all like happy and like party-ish, and there's like llama talk and stuff like that. And then it has like all the llama stuff, and then all of a sudden it says directed by Terry Gilliam and Terry Jones. And it's very, very funny, but it's almost a little tiny bit racist because it's like some Mexican like yelling and stuff like that. But it's like the direct 180 of what's going on here just shows you the amount of absurdity that's going to happen in this movie. And from what I read, I think it was like Terry Jones or something like that, Terry Gilliam. They talked about doing this sequence because they wanted to basically have the audience to have something to enjoy and to kind of push themselves into the movie, which is going to be about this tale of King Arthur and the absurdity of what Monty Python is doing. But that leads into the 90-some minutes of this movie, which is basically King Arthur, the Sword and the Stone, Pendragon, all that good stuff, played by Graham Chapman. His Patsy, who was, of course, played by Terry Gilliam. They are wandering through the countryside looking for the Knights of the Round Table. And this movie could be straightforward, but because it's Monty Python, it has to go veer off in different sketch points. And the first sketch moment in this segment is when they go up to a castle, and we basically have what is the famous swallow discussion. And swallows are little tiny birds, very small white birds. And basically, he's trying to recruit the lord of this castle to be part of the Knight of the Round Table. It's not really explained why he's going to these locations, but he is, doing what he's doing. And they question why he has no horse, and they question why his Patsy has coconuts. And the reason for that is because they're making fun of the fact that they had a low budget. So they had to use coconuts, which is what ADR, which is, when they're putting in sounds and so on and so forth. They basically use that idea to make it sound like their horse noises, and of course the actors are riding around like they're on horses and stuff like that. But then it leads into a discussion about how they found these coconuts in some location, but how did they get there? And then they start talking about swallows, about how swallows are very small and coconuts are very large, so it wouldn't make any sense. And the discussion goes on for like, I don't know, almost 5 minutes, maybe a little bit less than that, where they just started like discussing about coconuts and of course and swallows, and of course King Arthur gets tired of it and just kind of walks away, and they're just discussing it. It becomes a huge running joke throughout the movie, because you see it with Bedivere. You know, he at the very first point you see Bedivere, he's holding a swallow with a coconut attached to it, and then like the very end with the Bridge of Death, there's another segment with the coconut and the swallow. It's such an amazing joke that has such an amazing payoff in each time it's used, that you don't almost see it coming, and when it does come, it's just so freaking funny and so irreverent and so audacious and so absurd that it's super hilarious. And there's another running gag which I'll get to in a second, but this leads to the point where we see King Arthur talking to his people, the people that he's controlled over. But the funny thing about this is, and it reminds me, I'm going to go into Star Wars for a second, where Star Wars has this thing where you're so ingrained into the psychology of what's going on with the Clone Wars and stuff like that. You never think about the smaller subset of people or the smaller galaxy of people who are under that authoritarian dictator rule, where a lot of times they don't even know what's going on. They have no idea that Palpatine's a guy who's in control of the Senate. Most of the time, they're not even worried about it. They're dealing with their lives and so on and so forth. And that's what's going on here, where King Arthur comes across some of his people, his vagrants, and this is the point where I was like, this movie is brilliant. The swallow stuff's really funny, but this is brilliant because when they start getting into, we have Eric Idle, who they first meet, who's playing Dennis. They have multiple roles in this movie. But you have two other characters, which are Michael Palin and Terry Jones, and they get a discussion about authoritarian rule and about dictatorships and about how the King Arthur legend is absurd and ridiculous. And that is what is so cleverly written about this movie and about this segment in general, is they're basically tearing down the whole idea of King Arthur and his authoritarian rule, and they're doing it in a way that is funny, is ridiculous. The fact that they are covered in crap and mud and they're playing around in mud and stuff like that, and they're giving actually competent like dialogue, is really, really clever, and some of the most ingenious stuff in the movie that gets so overlooked by like the Rabbit and the Black Knight. But I love it. It's one of my favorite segments that I never knew even really thought about. You know, there's the point where in the Matrix Reloaded, when they have the architect talking about, of course, the Matrix and stuff like that, it doesn't make sense when you sit there, and it's actually kind of baffling. But when you sit down and you actually watch it and listen to it, it's really kind of like clever and really kind of impotent to the whole idea of what the Matrix is. But that's what's going on here, and that's why I love that so much. But he gets tired of everything. Once again, they're still arguing, so he moves on to the next sketch, which is, of course, we have Bring Out Your Dead segment, which is another famous sequence where he's rolling around this little town, village, and he's like, bring out your dead, ringing the bell, and I can't remember who the other guy is. I think it's like Terry Gilliam or Terry Jones or Michael Palin or something. But Michael Palin has a guy over his shoulder, and he's going to put him onto this cart where all the dead people are, because this is dealing with like the Black Plague and the very famous, virus and stuff like that. And they started talking about like dead people and stuff like that. And of course, the guy on the shoulder is not dead, but they keep saying, "Oh, you're dead," blah blah blah. It's very, very funny. And then the guy's like, "I'm getting better." He's like, "No, you're not. You're gonna die in a week." And they actually knock the guy in the head. He put him in the cart. It doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't really match up to anything, but it's very, very funny. It's a segment like you would have like in between of two major segments, where we would have this small segment of Bring Out Your Dead type of thing. But it's very, very funny. But then it leads on to, of course, the Black Knight stuff, which is some of the most famous stuff in the movie, where this Black Knight is basically taking on a knight of some sort. He kills the knight and blah blah blah. And then the Black Knight, which is guarding this like small bridge that King Arthur needs to go over, he's standing guard, and King Arthur's like, "I like your gist of your jib and stuff like that, and I want to basically recruit you to the Knights of the Round Table." But because the Black Knight's not responding, he's being kind of a pain in the ass a little bit, because he's kind of that mall cop type of character. King Arthur gets tired. He's going to move on, but the Black Knight is very, very for his protecting of the bridge, so he takes on King Arthur. And it leads into some very, very funny sequences of basically the Black Knight losing all his limbs, which is really, really funny. And in the process, every time he loses a limb, he's like, "'Tis but a scratch." He's like, "You pansy." He's making all these like really funny gestures and jabs at King Arthur to the point he loses like his arms and his legs, and he's on the ground and he's still going after King Arthur, and it's really, really funny. It's kind of like very, very violent, but it's very, very goofy, and it's just another great segment of just how good and absurd the Monty Python crew can be when they are let alone to do what they want to do. And that's why, like I said, once again, why the movie works and why it's so absurd is the fact that they can have a segment where they have the Black Knight losing all his limbs, still trying to take on King Arthur, and King Arthur just keeps running away, walking away like nothing's happening. So it's a very funny segment. John Cleese plays the Black Knight perfectly. John Cleese, I think, has the most roles in this movie, maybe out of all the actors in this movie. But he, once again, it's just another fantastic character. So now another running joke gag in this movie that is not as well known as the swallow thing is the monks. The monks are weirdly in this movie for they are singing or they're chanting this chant of some sort, but they're hitting themselves with boards. I don't understand really the plot or point of it, but it's very, very funny because they're just randomly hitting themselves after each chant lyric or whatever. But it becomes a running gag throughout the movie because you hear it in several times. You hear it in the animation sequences when they're like falling off the whatever, the like lemmings or whatever in the animated sequence. And then the Antioch priests singing it as well. I don't know. I haven't looked into it. I don't know exactly what the point of it was, but it's one of those absurd things where it's just like, it's funny, but why is it funny? Maybe it's just funny because they're hitting themselves with boards. Maybe it's the idea of how insane the idea of monkism is, or religion, or what they are dealing with. But it has this moment, but it leads into the bigger sequence or bigger sketch moment where basically we have the townsfolk are going to burn a woman for whatever reason. It's never fully explained, but they have dressed her up as a witch with a fake nose and everything. And we have our introduction of Bedivere, which is played by Terry Jones. And it's really, really funny and really kind of clever because it is very similar to the sketch that they would do later on in Life of Brian with the whole Stony thing, which I think is actually funnier. But basically, they bring this woman up to be tried by Bedivere, and Bedivere is the Sherlock Holmes of this movie, where he's he's able to deduce and is very smart at what he does. But like I said, he has a swallow in the coconut, which is really, really funny. And he starts questioning why these townsfolk want to burn her alive, and they just say she's a witch. At some point, John Cleese's character says she got turned into a newt, and Bedivere's like, a newt? He's like, well, I got better, which he's lying. But then they get in the whole segment where they're like, if she's a witch, she'd be made out of wood, and of course, she would be able to float. Well, what else could float? And they start naming like little tiny rocks, stuff like that. And then that's when King Arthur comes into effect. He's like, a duck. And I'm like, I start laughing because it's so absurd what they're trying to do. But it's like, a duck, okay. So they have this scale that they put the duck and the woman on, and they weigh the exact same weight, which makes no sense because the duck would be way skinnier, way smaller in weight size, but they somehow weigh the same, and the woman's like, oh, good lord, and they carry off to be burned alive at the stake. And it's making fun of the whole Salem witch trials, the whole idea of the scared nature of townsfolk and religion and stuff like that. Once again, it's dealing with religion and the nature of that situation. But this is where Bedivere becomes the first knight of the round table. It's very cool to watch, very fun, very entertaining. The whole segment leading up to is very, very funny. But then it's going to do a montage where it's going to introduce every other Knights of the Round Table through a book, which has their pictures. My favorite, of course, is Sir not going to be appearing in this film, which is a little baby. I also like the Robin, Sir Robin stuff, which is just him and how scared he is and stuff like that. So that's very, very funny, but it leads into like moving the plot forward faster and quicker, getting this movie more insane and ridiculous and absurd. But it leads into like the Camelot stuff where the Knights of the Round Table end up at Camelot. It leads into a very famous sequence of the dance sequence, which was Monty Python did dance and musical numbers like the Lumberjack song and so on and so forth. Very, very funny stuff, very humorous stuff. I enjoy it. I think it's funny. You can see them like rambunctiously around the castle, dancing, kicking stuff off the table, blah blah blah. The funnier part about this segment is they see the castle, they're all excited, Camelot, and then Patsy goes, "It's just a model," and King Arthur goes, "Shh." And basically at the end of this whole dance sequence, we realize it's just a fantasy, and the fantasy, of course, is they basically go, it's such a silly place, which is a very funny segment because they're like imagining what it'd be like to live at Camelot, and then they realize, oh, we gotta move on to our whatever our quest is, which leads them to seeing God, which is a very well done animated sequence. Of course, they go on the quest for the Holy Grail. I think when they do animated stuff in these movies, I think they do some of the best work that Monty Python's ever done, because it's very of like a Ralph Bakshi style feel to it, and the ideas and sequences. It has a very dry sense of humor. It doesn't always make sense. I think some of the interstitial animated stuff in this movie is really out of place, but it has its like charm to it, which is really fascinating. I think Terry Gilliam did a lot of the animation for this movie, if I remember right. I can't remember. There's a really funny sequence where he has a heart attack in the movie, but the animation stuff is just, it's so gorgeously done, but it is very Monty Python-esque. So, and they attack, or they actually end up at a castle where it is being held basically by a bunch of French people. And this is where we get into the very French stereotype guy, which I find very, very funny. And John Cleese plays the main French guy. And basically he taunts and makes fun of the English people. And so there's a small mini war that is going to take place between them two. But because the French people own this castle and they get the upper hand, they're throwing like rodents and chickens and cows over the castle. And one of them gets killed. One of the patsies gets killed. And this leads to, of course, the very famous Trojan Rabbit comedic sketch joke where they build a Trojan Rabbit. They put it up to like the castle, like the Trojan horse. They're gonna get in there and kill all the French people. But of course, the Knights of Round Table somehow forget that they're literally not in the Trojan Rabbit. So they're standing outside the castle in a bunker somewhere. The Trojan Rabbit's being brought in, and they're literally not in the Trojan Rabbit like a Trojan horse. And it's very funny because it's like, you guys are so smart, but you did something so stupid. And of course, the Trojan Rabbit is catapulted over the roof or over the castle, kills one of the patsies, and it's good stuff. It's very, very funny, and I enjoy it, but it's so absurd. It's so absurd. I love absurd humor, but that is insanely absurd. So, but before I go on to the next segment, I do have to recognize one of my favorite lines of dialogue in the movie that I enjoy telling people in real life. It's your mother was a hamster and your father smelled of elderberries. It's such a ridiculous like line of dialogue, but it's very, very funny. It's a good joke. It makes me laugh every time I hear it. It's like the tis but a scratch. It's a well piece of humor that doesn't make any sense, but it's a nice little knock against like the English stereotype and stuff like that. And it's very, very funny. You're calling your mother a hamster. I find it funny. So, but it leads into like these 4 or 5 different interstitial sketch stories where the first one is Sir Robin, and Sir Robin is basically, he has this entourage of like singers and musicians and his patsy and stuff like that. And what makes it so funny is the music that they're singing, and the singer, the guy singing all the music, is basically like what he's singing about is very disturbing. Like he's talking about he's talking about entrails and how Sir Robin would be killed and how Sir Robin's a scared puss basically. And Sir Robin's just like, what is even going on? But it leads them to the three-headed knight, which is like Terry Gilliam, Graham Chapman, and Terry Jones maybe, or Eric Idle or something like that. But it basically, they are confronted with the situation. Sir Robin's going to eventually run away because he's a scaredy cat. He's a chicken. And he's able to get them to start arguing with one another so he can escape. But that segment's kind of awesome because it's like three-headed monster, but they're arguing with one another in the way they're doing it. And they're talking about who's going to kill Sir Robin and his crew. And they finally decide it's going to be all 3 of them. But as Sir Robin's running away with his crew, they're singing about his cowardice and stuff like that. It's very, very funny, very, very humorous, very, very just... Eric Idle just went for it, and it's just very, very funny. But it leads into another segment, which is the Tale of Sir Galahad, which is basically the most sexually oriented segment of the entire movie. This segment could have been rated R. There's actually some deleted stuff that makes it very R-rated, but it's PG movie. It's the 70s, so it would have been PG-13. But he sees a Grail at the top of a castle, and he goes to the castle, and it's filled with bunch of virgin women, very attractive virgin women, and they basically have never seen a man or haven't seen one in a long time. So they want to have sex with him, and they want to do everything in their power to make him happy. And it's very of its time, but it's very, very funny. Sir Galahad's very contentious against it at first. He's very against it. But as he sees how many women are in this castle, he kind of goes for it. And Michael Palin just like owns this section. He's just very, very funny, and all the women in it are very, very funny. And as soon as he's about ready to do his thing about, you know, pleasing all the women, Lancelot, John Cleese's character, and a couple of knights walk in, and basically as they think they're rescuing from temptation Sir Galahad, and you're just like, no, what are you doing? It's like one of those moments where you know it's a little perverse and a little sexist to think, oh, you could have pleased all these women, but it's very, very funny because it's like, it's one of those like teasing moments where you're like, oh my god, it was so close but so far. It's like that dream where you have the object in front of you but you can't get to it. It's funny, it's hilarious, it's one of the better sketch moments in the movie, but like I said, it's very of its time, so it really wouldn't work as well today. And then of course we have Bedivere. They're on their own quest to figure out where the Holy Grail's at. The problem with this segment, scene 24, I don't think it's as funny. I think it's a little weird. It's a little rough around the edges because it's just so off tilt on what it's trying to do. It's trying to be funny, but it's really not. Terry Gilliam plays man from scene 24, which is actually kind of a funny joke. Is the only reference of a scene in the movie, they actually say scene 24. But then they found themselves basically being confronted by the Knights of Knee. And the Knights of Knee, of course, is another funny, famous sketch segment in this movie where the Knights of Knee hold a special power over everyone, being very powerful and dangerous because of the word knee and some other words I can't remember. But basically they task the two characters to find shrubberies, which is funny because they end up finding the shrubberies. They end up like coming back with Sir Robin because of a guy named like Bob the Shrubber or something like that, or Dan the Shrubber, and they get the upper hand and they run off and stuff like that. But it's very, very funny. Is it my favorite part? No, but the Knights of Knee is a very famous segment that has a lot of weight behind it, and just the idea and the absurdity is what makes it work. So, but it leads into the final portion of this, like where they separate. And the separation, we have Lancelot, who is going to rescue what he thinks is a woman. But the beginning of this story is basically we have this very effeminate guy who's played by Terry Jones, and he's going to be married. His father has set up this arranged marriage to gain traction and land, which is what a lot of marriages were meant to do, was gain power and land and so on and so forth, so they could have stronger armies and whatnot. And the Terry Jones kid guy or whatever doesn't want to get married. He wants to sing. He's a very, you know, artistic individual, and because Michael Palin, who plays the father, is very against that, he's like, you're gonna marry, we're gonna get this land. And there's a very funny sequence where Eric Idle and of course Graham Chapman are guards, but they're really stupid, so they don't understand the information that Michael Palin's character is trying to relate to him about not letting him leave the room. It leads to Terry Jones' character basically shooting an arrow, almost killing Eric Idle, the patsy character for Lancelot. And Lancelot reads the note and he goes to attack the castle. Well, one of my favorite segments in this entire movie is basically Lancelot. We see him chasing towards the castle, but they keep using the same clip over and over and over, where he is literally starting at one point, moving towards them, and then they show the same clip over where he's moving the same segment moving forward, and they do that 5 or 6 times for like almost a minute, where it's just like at some point he's going to get to this castle, but he keeps starting at the same point. And it's very absurd in its humor, but then it leads into basically Lancelot, John Cleese's character, killing everyone in this castle, or almost everyone. And it's bloody, it's violent, it's insanely absurd. Like I said, I'm going to say absurd a lot because it is insanely absurd that he's just killing people for no reason, because he thinks he's like rescuing people. He thinks these people are the enemy. And it leads him up to the room where he thinks he's rescuing a woman, but it's really the Terry Jones effeminate character. And Michael Palin realizes he's a Knight of the Round Table from Camelot, and his son Michael Palin, the Terry Jones character, tries to escape through the window. Michael Palin cuts the rope of the bed sheets or whatever, think he's killed his son, and like it leads to more bloodshed, really funnily, and then it leads to the death of the woman's father, and of course Terry Jones' son. Terry Jones is still alive. Michael Palin is still alive. There's a big dance sequence. It's just like absurd and everything it's doing, because, you know, Lancelot is like trying to escape, but he's like, the whole sequence is absurd in its nature of what it's trying to do, which is a rescue mission, but it doesn't really have anything to do with the Holy Grail or anything of that nature. It's just a very, very funny sequence. And like I said, I really like the sequence where they keep using the same footage over and over and over. So it looks like that Lancelot is never going to get to the castle, and eventually he does and kills everyone. But because this movie's only 95 minutes, we're starting to get to the kind of conclusion, or the third part of this movie, where we come across Tim the Enchanter. Of course, is played by John Cleese. And Tim the Enchanter is a guy who's just, for some reason, throwing fireballs everywhere. The Knights of the Round Table are very scared of him. But the thing I find funny about this is when John Cleese is on screen as Tim the Enchanter, sometimes they'll do a thing where if they have two of the actors doing different roles, they'll add somebody in there where you can't see their face. So there's like a stunt double or body double. But they don't do that with Tim the Enchanter and John Cleese. John Cleese is nowhere to be seen as a knight anywhere in the scene. He's just there as Tim the Enchanter, and he eventually shows up out of nowhere. It's really, really funny. But basically, Tim the Enchanter is able to take him to the cave Bedenog, which is where the rabbit sequence comes into effect. And the rabbit sequence is most famous for the fact of the Holy Hand Grenade of Antioch. But the rabbit basically is a rabbit. It's a white rabbit. It's a very small, cuddly creature, and it holds a dark secret where it is actually a monster that kills people, and they don't believe it. They see this rabbit, they're like, oh, this can't kill anybody, and in fact kills people. It has a murderous streak to it, and of course they decide they're going to attack the rabbit. It doesn't go well, and this is where the Holy Hand Grenade of Antioch comes in, where there's just some random priests just with their group of people. This is how low budget this movie is, where they have to have, you know, this group, this big quest for the Holy Grail, but because they have so few people, they can't show the massive amounts of people. And so we see the priests, and they bring him down as Michael Palin and of course Eric Idle. And they're a very funny segment where like you have to throw in the count of 3, but you can't throw in the count of 5. And they throw the hand grenade, and of course it, you know, causes death and destruction of the rabbit. And they go in the cave where they see the beast, and the beast attacks them in a very fun, very energetic, animated sequence, which I really enjoy. But then it leads them outside to the Bridge of Death. But in the process of all this, the thing that very, very weird and strange, but very of Monty Python's ilk, is there is a segment going on where we have a documentary historian who is basically telling the tale of King Arthur, who's going through the different locations that King Arthur went to. And it's very strange because this movie's set 939 AD or something like that, 935. And some reason there's a documentarian historian just there in this movie who gets slaughtered by some knight, and I'm like, what is even going on here? But it becomes a murder investigation that will play out to the very end of this movie. But we see some like police officers, we see some detectives, but we see the group that has survived the bridge, the Knights of the Round Table, at the Bridge of Death, where the man from Scene 24 appears, which is Terry Gilliam's character. And I love the sequence because they basically have to cross the bridge, but they have to answer questions. Lancelot is the first one to go over. They ask like questions 3, like what's your favorite color, what's your quest, what's your name. Lancelot gets across the bridge, and then of course Eric Idle's Sir Robin. He's like awesome, brave, but he ends up dying because the Scene 24 man basically asks him a question he can't answer, and Sir Galahad dies because he answers the wrong color that his favorite color is. But the nice thing about this that has a great payoff is Lancelot and Bedivere are basically ask the same questions, and it brings up this is the last time I think it brings it up, but it brings up the coconut thing again. And I think it's very, very funny that the man from Scene 24 can't answer it, and he ends up dying. So it's a great payoff to a very funny joke that's been a running gag throughout this movie about swallows and coconuts. But they cross the bridge, and they can't find Lancelot anywhere, and this leads into like the most absurd thing in the entire movie, where Lancelot is being arrested for the murder of this historian. He's against a police officer car, stuff like that. So he's probably going to give him information on what's going on. And then it leads to the very end of this movie, where King Arthur and Bedivere, who were the very first people in this movie, they take a boat over to this castle. They're going to get the Holy Grail. The movie's going to be successful. But this movie has to have that last minute of you're not going to get what you want in this quest, because the castle is, of course, held by the same French people that were during the Trojan Rabbit escapade. And it's very, very funny. It's the same exact people. They're doing the exact same thing, But King Arthur is prepared this time because he has his Crusaders, which is this massive, I'm assuming, stock footage shot of all these like Crusader people, and they're going to attack this castle. What becomes like the most insane thing I've ever seen in an ending to a movie, maybe ever. As they're close to attacking the castle, the police show up, like the cops, like modern day cops, show up and arrest every single one of these Crusaders. They arrest King Arthur, they arrest Bedivere for the murder of the historian. So the gag not only pays off well, but it pays off ingeniously, because not only are we never going to get our Holy Grail moment, but this is what Monty Python is known for doing. They are known for taking a segment and just completely doing a 180 on it that makes no sense, that becomes completely absurd, and completely just throws the movie into some strange, weird, like universe of a Twilight Zone. And of course they're basically sent to prison for the murder of a historian that they really didn't get involved with. But it leads into the French basically holding the castle, which is really funny. It leads into like another credit sequence, which is more of like a, go get your popcorn song type of song and stuff like that. And that's the end of the movie. That is Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And this movie is filled to the brim with jokes. It's filled to the brim with comedy. The movie just works on every level. There's a reason this movie is considered one of the greatest comedies of all time. Like I said, it holds a special place in my heart because of how funny, how quickly paced it moves, how ingenious the jokes are, just how insane it really is. And I'm so baffled by the fact that it does so many twists and turns and 180s, but just works. It works on a level that, how does it work? It should not work, but because it's Monty Python, because it's dealing with some of the most comedic geniuses in history, it just somehow makes it work. And when you get to the absurd nature of the documentary and historian, it somehow feels right in the movie, and that shouldn't work, but it does. So yeah, that's my take of Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I know this has been a long discussion, but it's a movie with so many great jokes. I put it up there with stuff like Spaceballs and stuff like that because it feels like a movie that does so much well, even though it has some weird moments, but those moments, they don't deter from the fact of how good Monty Python and the Holy Grail is. So, but if you haven't seen it, definitely watch it. You may not like it as much as I like it because it's a very of its time. It's a very Monty Python type of thing, but there's a reason it's funny. There's a reason it's as well known as it is, and a reason it has as many memorable sketches as it does. So anyways, that'll do it. That'll be my take on Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments below what's your favorite segment of this movie, what's your favorite sketch of this movie. Like I said, there's a lot, so you can have your plethora of picks. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching. Hit that subscribe button to join Movie Emporium. Hit that notification bell at the top to find out what's coming next. And of course, comment below on any video that you watch on my channel. Otherwise, see you guys on the next video. Peace out.
What's up, guys? Thank you so much for checking out Movie Emporium. I really appreciate it. If you want to, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Hit the notification button and the bell at the top. Find out what's coming next for Movie Emporium. Also, check out these two videos. They're amazing. I think they're awesome. I think you'll enjoy them too. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching, guys. We'll see you next time.